Of the days of my earliest childhood before I started school, I remember little. I remember bright autumn days when the garden was covered with brown leaves fallen from the oak and sycamore trees, which bounded the garden, which Sykes had not yet swept away. On breezy days I watched as the leaves were swept off the ground and glided across the lawns haphazardly in the swirling eddies of the breeze. I imagined the leaves in a race and traced a finishing line near the house with my shoe, and appointed myself judge of the winners. When the breeze was not strong enough for them to race without assistance, I would take Sykes's broom, which he always left propped up against the same corner of the garden shed, and furiously brush the leaves along the path towards the finishing line. I remember rainy days in winter when I was not allowed in the garden, when I would sit in the living room on the sofa and watch the patterns made by the raindrops as they traced their paths down the window pane, and tried to guess which drop would be the first to disappear into the general dampness as it reached the wood of the window frame. I remember light summer evenings, when it was difficult to go to sleep because it was not yet dark, hearing the voices of my parents and their friends, and the older children of their friends, in the garden below my window, the sound floating dreamily up to where I lay restless in bed. I remember that before I did go to sleep on such evenings, I would hold my breath for some time. How long, I did not know, allowing the sounds to pass through my head until they merged and lost all meaning, and that by this means I had the power to go into my mind to another place, in which there was no sound, a place which was still and had no limits at all. And I remember standing with my parents and with Roger on the dark platforms of the grey railway stations of Manchester and Crewe when we went away for holidays, watching with awe as the huge steam locomotives puffed their way slowly to a stop, making more noise than should have been possible in the world, as they pushed their steam out and upwards towards the soot-coated glass of the roof high above. I knew from an early age that my family was different. My father was always known as Sir Alfred. All my friends' fathers were addressed as Mr., except for the one or two who were doctors. I knew that our house, an early 18th century manor house in the countryside, outside Clitheroe in the heart of the Ribble Valley, was far bigger than the houses most people lived in. I knew that we were unusual in having a household staff, though under my father's careful stewardship of our small estate it had dwindled to 4. Mr. Bevan, who helped my father to manage the business side of the estate, keeping accounts and dealing with the lease of our 2 or 3 tenant farmers, Sykes, who took care of the garden, Mrs. Penfold, who cooked when we had visitors and took care of the inside of the house, and her husband, Mr. Penfold, who took care of the outside of the house and did odd jobs, and sometimes drove my father when he went to catch the train for London, or my mother when she had a lot of shopping to do, and, without ever telling my mother, placed the odd bet for my father on the cup final or the Grand National. I learned that we were proud Lancastrians. Our coat of arms featured the red rose. We had seats at Old Trafford during the cricket season, and at dinner, when my father proposed the loyal toast, we claimed the privilege of toasting the King, the Duke of Lancaster. My parents explained to me that the baronetcy was the family's reward for having backed the right side more than once in the various royal succession questions that kept recurring for more than a century after the Civil War. Generations later, we were still on good terms with the royal family. My parents knew the King and Queen and were their guests at garden parties and dinners. When we were old enough, Roger and I were introduced to them too, and I found them very charming. All this seemed normal to us. My father would talk about the King in much the same way as any man would talk about his friend.